Okay, a very good afternoon, distinguished participants and speakers. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the final session of today's roundtable on charting ASEAN's adaptation playbook. I'm Joanne, the Senior Fellow and Co-Coordinator at the ASEAN Studies Centre. So today we've had three very interesting, thought-provoking sessions examining the region's shifting geopolitical and economic landscape, as well as the strategic interests of major and middle powers in the region. So now in this session, we turn our attention inward to explore how ASEAN as an institution can respond to this complex external pressure while maintaining a cornerstone in the region's peace, stability, and economic growth. So in this context, we'll be discussing whether ASEAN's modus operandi, such as its consensus-based approach and role as a central convener, are sufficient to navigate the speed and complexity of today's global crisis. We also heard that the rise of minilateral groupings such as the Quad and BRICS introduces new layers of competition, while significant shifts in the global economy, including the retreat from globalization or economic nationalism, as we heard about earlier, are prompting ASEAN member states to really recalibrate its economic strategies. So amidst these changes, concerns are growing over ASEAN's ability to act collectively as individual member states increasingly feel pressured to adapt their foreign and economic policies in response to their national interests. So this session will explore whether ASEAN can chart a cohesive adaptation playbook that keeps it relevant and resilient. So we hope our speakers today will try to address some crucial questions like whether ASEAN-led mechanisms like the East Asia Summit and other economic initiatives can be reinvigorated to help ASEAN navigate these turbulent times. So are we seeing a risk that ASEAN's unity could disintegrate as member states pivot in different directions? So to discuss these questions, we are very honored to have with us three highly distinguished speakers who will shed light and perspectives on these critical issues. Our first speaker, Dr. Aries Arugay, is the Senior Visiting Fellow and Coordinator of the Philippine Studies Program at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. With his extensive experience in the region's political security challenges, Dr. Arugay is really well placed to address the topic of emerging minilateralism and its implication for ASEAN. So he will explore whether these new groupings will compete or complement ASEAN's initiatives and how the region can respond to this evolving dynamics. So our panel second speaker, Mr. Roland Rajah, is the lead economist and director of the Indo-Pacific Development Center at the Lowy Institute. He's a recognized thought leader on the economic landscape in the Indo-Pacific region. So today he will provide critical insights into how ASEAN can adapt to the geo-economic changes and create opportunities for deeper integration within the region. And our final and important speaker, Ambassador Sihasak Phuangketkeow, is the former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Thailand and Secretary General of the Asian Peace and Reconciliation Council. So he brings decades of diplomatic experience, particularly in navigating ASEAN's complex political terrain. So Ambassador Sihasak will delve into strategies for reinvigorating ASEAN's driven cooperative mechanism, offering his perspective on how ASEAN can enhance its agility and cohesion in addressing today's global and regional crises. So without much ado, I would like to hand the floor over to Dr. Arugay, please. Thank you. And please keep it to about 15 minutes max. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to ISEAS for this opportunity to share my thoughts. And I was thinking why they chose a Filipino to present on minilateralism, perhaps because not only because the country, if we will rely on the State of Southeast Asia survey of ISEAS, is considered to be one of the most open to supporting minilateral arrangements at the moment, but also the Philippines is also a member in some of these minilaterals. So we know that these minilaterals constitute something bright and shiny for scholars and practitioners, and we all know that we're attracted to bright and shiny objects, but it has also contributed to the alphabet soup of acronyms that we have to understand, not only because they're important, but it matters greatly as ASEAN members navigate the complex and increasingly uncertain regional strategic environment. In this age of flux and transition in turbulent Asia, to what extent do minilateral arrangements address some of these uncertainties, and how could they be juxtaposed with older, more established, and those that have been considered credible uh, mechanisms, such as mainly multilateral mechanisms. So, as far as a consensual definition, just like many other things in what we study, there's complexity on understanding what minilateralism is. But if you just focus on the history of ASEAN and its members, we know that minilateral arrangements have existed many years before. So this is something old. There are some things new, but we also know that certain minilateral arrangements emanate from other similar sort of mechanisms in other parts of the world. There seems to be some agreement that it's larger than bilateral arrangements, but not so big that it becomes some sort of a multilateral organization. So maybe they put it there 3 to 9 in one article that I've read, mainly because if it becomes 10 or more, then it's ASEAN already. In terms of nature, the increasing observation is that minilaterals are exclusive, unlike multilateral organizations, wherein, like the United Nations or regional organizations, it seeks to somehow have a wider scope or include as many as possible. They're increasingly seen as functional. So um, contrast that with comprehensive partnerships that are very broad in terms of scope. These functional areas are not only security, but also economic. Unlike treaties and alliances, they're quite flexible. But we also notice that in the present geopolitical environment, treaties are becoming far and far fewer in between. Like, you don't really read countries engaging themselves or signing treaties, uh, mutual defense treaties, military alliances, forming new security organizations in smaller number. So, to the extent that minilaterals somehow constitute an innovation in terms of being able to address rising issues, as well as a way to organize preferences and to somehow uh, lessen or mitigate the uncertainty and the tensions in the geopolitical environment. In terms of why are they being created, uh, those of us who teach international relations here could do a level of analysis problem and start with the systemic level, meaning there's something in the external environment that invites a lot of these minilateral arrangements that has something to do with the increasing uncertainty and volatility of the strategic environment, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. Other reasons could span from being able to secure short to medium term commitment from major powers. So, in a way, minilaterals somehow could increase the cost of major powers, changing their minds and uh, declining attention from certain agreements that have been made. Others also see that minilaterals defend the status quo, defend the regional based international order. Other controversial reasons is that this is a way to contain certain rising or revisionist powers. It's seen as to deter possible assertive or aggressive moves of powers wanting to assert their sphere of influence or build one. Um, from the point of view of smaller states that join minilaterals, somehow they if they're part of regional organizations, they see this as a possible quick fix due to perceived inefficiency and effectiveness of current institutions and mechanisms. So it's a band-aid, but at present, having a band-aid is better than exposing problems that, or at least problems that are unresolved. And finally, in a more benign way, some unilaterals that are very issue-focused tends to somehow give attention to non-traditional security issues that might have taken a backtrack given the fixation and preoccupation with geopolitics. So in a way, for example, during the pandemic, some unilaterals were really about addressing an issue quickly that might take more time if they're going to be used in existing multilateral mechanisms. Now, what could be the limits or the some of the downsides of unilaterals, given that they're quickly formed, relatively quicker than multilateral organizations? There's increasing uncertainty on being able to sustain commitment. A lot of these unilaterals are in the form of executive agreements not ratified by the parliaments or other institutions within the country members themselves. So therefore, a quick reversal might be possible if certain leaders, or in terms of political succession, the government of the day does not seem to be open to continuing the commitment to these unilaterals. The promise is that these exits from unilaterals would be very hard given the stickiness of the national interest of countries that are joining them. But we all know that political elites hold a lot of sway in terms of being able to dictate foreign policy, pendulum swings, and whatnot. In terms of further contributing to existing divides, there's also been an observation that some unilaterals feature in-group, out-group dynamics in terms of who gets in the group, who gets to invite the members of these unilaterals. And not only that, if certain member states want to be part, but in the end are not invited or don't become members, then they could go and create or help create other challenger unilaterals that could contribute to a polarization that could end to be very pernicious. There could also be unintended consequences that there are perceptions that unilaterals contain certain countries, and it could worsen already existing perceptions and security dilemmas faced by countries already. And finally, we all know that yes, we can walk and chew gum and even post on social media all at the same time, but there's a carrying capacity for countries, particularly small powers, being able to put a lot of attention, equal attention to all these unilaterals. So there could be fatigue and even confoundment or confusion. In terms of ASEAN perceptions, I think the brain trust in the room could have more information, and we could talk about this more in the Q&A. But there seems to be these stages of perceptions towards these unilaterals. The classic ASEAN response seemed to be indifference, noted with thanks, right? Sometimes some ASEAN members at first were not too quick in being able to react or respond to some of these unilaterals. The example would be AUKUS, for example. There's an increasing, but at first, but if we rely again on the ISEAS State of Southeast Asia survey report, undermining ASEAN centrality has been the fear of some in terms of being able, how could unilaterals fit in the existing multilateral mechanisms by a convening power like ASEAN. But at least according to the State of Southeast Asia report, unilaterals have increasingly are becoming more and more important and considered relevant to ASEAN elites and their perception. So, for example, from 3 out of 10 to 4 out of 10 in the latest one, And only 1 out of 10 of the respondents to the IC survey believe that unilaterals threaten ASEAN centrality. In terms of being seen as a strategy to contain rising powers, all you need to do is to somehow watch or listen to some of the statements being made by certain countries during the formation of some of these unilaterals, and you'll have an idea that there seems to be this mutually exclusive view that unilaterals pose a threat to the regional order, when the supposed intended consequence of some of these unilaterals is to actually defend the international rules-based order. And finally, we all know that not all countries, what's good about multilateral arrangements is that there's this assumption of legal and political equality among all members. By signing the treaty, everyone is at least at face value politically equal. In terms of unilaterals, because they're not formed by treaties and such, to what extent could unilaterals reinforce already existing hierarchies? Are some voices louder? Are some countries strong because they're stronger in terms of military and defense or economy? Do they have a greater say in the running of these unilaterals, and therefore it becomes hostage to their own set of interests? Now let's go to the interesting part. What could be ASEAN strategies, or part of what this panel called the Adaptation Playbook? At first, let me just say that we will see more and more of these unilaterals in the coming future. There seemed to be a demonstration effect and learning that, oh, it's quite interesting that there's this new unilateral, so let's form another. So Quad plus, Squad, and then you have, of course, the trilateral between Japan, the Philippines, and the U.S. There was an attempt to come out with a smart acronym, but that has failed. So now they're more known as a trilateral. But let's remember that ASEAN has their own unilaterals from before, right? And Joanne wrote a piece on it in ISEAS perspective. So therefore, this is not totally novel as far as ASEAN is concerned. After the terrorist attack in Marawi City in the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines actually agreed on a trilateral on maritime and naval cooperation that was quickly formed and didn't actually need the assent of all ASEAN members for it to be formed. These strategies are not mutually exclusive. They can overlap, but these are some of the action points that ASEAN members can do or had done before. First is to deny the salience of these unilaterals and just continue to be indifferent towards them. The second could be to recognize overlaps. The idea here is to somehow see the connections between, in terms of shared goals, shared objectives, between existing ASEAN multilateral mechanisms and some of these unilaterals. Where do interests merge and where do they diverge? Third is to work towards not just recognizing the overlaps and mutually work towards these goals, but to work for possible engagement. So this will require more from countries. So, for example, there is, like, if everyone's familiar with BIMP IAGA, I mean, that's an example of a unilateral that has long existed within ASEAN, and it has considered to be a burgeoning and salient mechanism, unilateral mechanism within a few members of ASEAN itself. Strategy 4 is to build and strengthen these unilaterals, BIMP IAGA, the trilateral between Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And I'm gonna borrow Ibu Mari's term, through constructive gradualism or incrementalism, right? Because in a way that it is within the comfort of ASEAN's modus operandi. And lastly is to do a lot of homework as part of ASEAN in terms of reforming institutions and mechanisms. I think Ambassador will talk more about ASEAN itself. And this is my last slide. Let me just say that some of these minilaterals could be seen as a way of reducing transaction costs, just like how ASEAN was seen as reducing transaction costs. Minilaterals could also be seen as this way. I distinctly remember part of ASEAN's mantra is that we need national resilience. Long before resilience was used as a term, you can already see this in ASEAN documents. But we all know that national resilience is critical for the building of regional resilience. So if those two are contradictory to one another, ASEAN member states will always choose national resilience over regional resilience. So the key is how to have a complete overlap between pursuing national goals, and at the same time making sure that the collective interests of ASEAN are not compromised. Confidence building is important. A lot of listening, a lot of truth telling as well, explaining where each other is coming from. We all know that there's been murmurs, nothing official, for example, of how the current policy of the Philippines has evolved to the extent that it has become quite problematic, if I may say so myself, as perceived by other states within ASEAN or outside ASEAN. We need to keep these conversations going at the level of which we're able to at least explain where each other is coming from. ASEAN, and this was reinforced by our keynote speaker this morning, is in need of soul searching in institutional and structural reforms, but also to make sure that if there is this idea that minilaterals are undermining ASEAN centrality, that we really know what ASEAN centrality is. That's the thing. There's no document. There could be 10 interpretations of what ASEAN centrality is. And the worst is that sometimes other states define centrality for us rather than us claiming what ASEAN centrality should be. So ASEAN should define centrality on their own terms and remind other powers that they cannot do this on ASEAN's behalf. And finally, there's a need to shore up ASEAN. The ASEAN-led mechanisms, the ASEAN Plus 3, the EAS, the ARF should not be sidetracked and used by other countries for their own agendas, because by doing so, then ASEAN is not helping itself in asserting this centrality. It must assert its convening power, but not only that, to ensure that in these mechanisms, its agenda is the best. It should assert that its agenda is the best path to peace and stability in the region. I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arugay. I think your explanation has been very comprehensive. You talk about the pros and the cons, and we know that it is minilateralism are exclusive, they are functional, but it addresses many rising issues. But of course, there are uncertain commitments, and it could also cause a polarization. So you have given us a very balanced view, and I also agree with you. And in fact, I had that paper earlier to talk about minilateralism within ASEAN itself. So this is actually not a new concept, and I'm sure later on we will have a lot of questions addressing Quad or Squad, which we can talk about. And of course, if anyone wants to ask about the ASEAN minilateralism, like our Malacca Straits Patrol, the BIM Yaga, these are some very, very good examples. And of course, later on, Ambassador Sihasak is going to come in to talk about ASEAN mechanism to see how we can actually also address these issues. So for now, I'm going to pass the time over to Mr. Roland Rajah to share the economic perspective. And I know that it is in every session, but let's hear your perspective in this session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. And it is always difficult to go last session of the day. Everyone's tired, and many things have been said before, but hopefully I'll say a few new things to keep things interesting. But thank you very much, Joan, and to ISEAS for having me here today. So the question I've been asked to answer is, how can ASEAN best respond to the geo-economic challenges it is currently facing? And we've all heard a lot about what those geo-economic challenges are. The central issue is the geostrategic rivalry between the United States and China, but then this very quickly bleeds over into broader tensions between a wider group of respective allies and partner countries, and then affecting third countries, such as those in ASEAN, caught in between. And critically, I think it's important to recognize that, the US-China geostrategic rivalry is fundamentally geo-economic in nature. It is China's economic rise that has put an end to America's unipolar moment, and it's China's economic rise which is driving the economic and technological tensions between the two. And most challenging for ASEAN is that economic interdependencies between China and the United States, including those networked across third countries, have now come to be seen as vulnerabilities rather than sources of economic efficiency and shared prosperity. And we should recognize that this view has also been greatly reinforced by the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And then making matters much more complicated on top of this is the revolution in digital technology, which continues to expand essentially the range of goods and services which are deemed sensitive for security reasons. So many of you will know the United States is looking at restrictions on connected vehicles, so basically EVs with Chinese technology in them, and digital services, for example, TikTok also being banned and heavily scrutinized. And so in this way, driven by the technological changes, the yard in the high fence, small yard strategy espoused by Jake Sullivan keeps getting larger in a somewhat natural and unpredictable and uncertain way. And the result of all this, of course, from the economic perspective and the ASEAN perspective, is this breakdown in multilateralism and the rising protectionism. But just going to some of the topics that were brought up in the last conversation, I think it's also important to recognize a lot of the conversation we've had today, I think, has framed it primarily in terms of a security-driven problem, right? Protectionism driven by security imperatives, when in reality there's a lot more going on, which is more sort of blunt politics. First, we have to recognize there is a global backlash against globalization, especially in Western countries and especially in the United States. It doesn't matter that most of the manufacturing jobs are actually destroyed by automation, not by trade, nor that, as we were discussing earlier, actually globalization was key to resilience in the experience of COVID-19, and also key to Australia's resilience in the episode of economic coercion with China. Globalization actually had a lot of benefits for resilience, but nonetheless, it's being thrown out, baby, with the bathwater. I think the second related problem to really recognize is how all of this also interacts with the climate crisis. And so here the problem is that it seems that policymakers seem to believe that the only way to really sort of galvanize stronger domestic climate policies is if that is directly linked to creating green jobs at home, regardless of whether or not this is economically feasible or globally efficient. And then again, the result is protectionism, like we see with the domestic subsidies in the IRA Act in the United States, or the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the EU. And then finally, we should just recognize that protectionism has always had its own allures, and it can become self-perpetuating through retaliation when one country acts unilaterally, but also now, just countries feeling they have much greater freedom to indulge in their own protectionist impulses, including because, as we've heard repeatedly today, the WTO dispute settlement mechanism isn't working. So in this context, what should ASEAN do is what I'll try and sort of focus on here. And I think the starting point is recognizing that the strategic autonomy of ASEAN countries comes from the region's economic strength and dynamism. When ASEAN was formed in 1967, its collective GDP was just 3% of America's. Today it is 14%, and by 2035 it will reach about 25% of America's GDP if ASEAN countries can broadly maintain their current economic trajectory. Even relative to China, ASEAN's lost a lot of ground to China over recent decades, but going forward, ASEAN's likely to see significant gains in terms of its relative position compared to China, as China's economy starts to slow down due to, in part, its shrinking demographics, as well as the end of its investment-driven hypergrowth. So the key implication is that if ASEAN can keep to its current economic trajectory, then it will only become of more importance to the superpowers themselves as a market for exports and investment, and in respect to its role in terms of dealing with global issues, including in terms of how the world economy is managed. So in other words, if ASEAN can keep to that kind of growth path, then it should have the foundations for a lot of agency in order to navigate all of the geostrategic tensions it is facing. The problem, of course, with this is that it's all a bit chicken and egg, because the question is, can ASEAN actually sustain its economic trajectory in the face of all the rising protectionism that we do see? And in my view, I tend to agree with, I think it was Alex from the previous panel, that there seems to be a pretty decent, depending on the scenario, a pretty decent pathway for ASEAN. It's hardly perfect, but to chart its way through the geo-economic problems that it's facing. We have spoken of many times today that the US-China economic tensions is seeing a diversion of trade in particular to third countries, and ASEAN, especially countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, have been big beneficiaries of that. Now, the big caveat that has to be put around that, of course, as we've heard before again, is that a lot of that just reflects Chinese inputs in the supply chain. So that's not really then providing that much benefit in terms of how much value is being created in ASEAN economies, and therefore incomes and jobs, right, that's actually being created in ASEAN itself. However, I think that's only a part of the story, and it's the wrong. If in this sort of scenario, where ASEAN can actually chart this path, that's probably an incomplete way of looking at it, right? Rather, it should be seen as the start of a process. First, that trade has to move, right? It starts with the basics. It starts with just basic final assembly, right? This is the old flying geese model. You start with the most basic thing, and then you slowly move up to more advanced elements of the production process. And the really, I think, promising thing, at least at this point, is it's very difficult to pass through the data in terms of the trade data to work out what's going on, but one can see it in the investment data. The investment data is much more positive for ASEAN. So if you look at greenfield manufacturing investment, FDI, coming in to ASEAN, this has really skyrocketed in the last year or two years or so. It averaged about $40 billion last decade per year. In 2023, it was nearly $100 billion going into greenfield manufacturing investment in ASEAN. In 2024, looks to be fairly similar at the current pace. And critically, most of this jump is being driven by China and the United States. So both players are getting involved in building these, as people have called it, dual supply chains that ASEAN would like to build. So that pathway seems to be there. Over time, that capital investment will turn into exports, and it will turn into upgrading and technology transfer and all the good things that are supposed to come with foreign investment, right? So a process could be starting here. Now, I think there are two important caveats to that sort of positive kind of message. I think the first is that ASEAN still needs to focus on its own competitiveness, and this then starts to go into what kind of partnerships it seeks in order to maximize the potential benefits from all of this reconfiguration. It still needs to compete with other jurisdictions, for example, India and maybe Bangladesh, countries like that. It also has to compete with automation, right? Automation is increasingly making it more viable for countries to reshore or move production to higher cost but higher skill locations, and so investing in a skill upgrade in particular is going to be very important. And then the third thing that one can identify is a need to meet, I think it's been mentioned once before, higher ESG standards, particularly around clean energy, right? Multinational companies, if you talk to them, you look at surveys, they're all saying they will move the investment, they will move it out of China, they'll move it to various countries, but you got to provide us with the clean energy or we're not coming. The second thing, of course, that could upset this kind of happy scenario is the darker one, where the global economy essentially kind of bifurcates into competing blocks. And then in that scenario, ASEAN actually would go from potentially the biggest beneficiary from a kind of medium decoupling, de-risking scenario to probably the biggest loser in terms of a full-blown kind of decoupling scenario. And there are plenty of those intermediate kind of signs of more negative things coming ASEAN's way. America is very unhappy about the big trade surpluses the region has with it. And they're also very unhappy about China's presence within ASEAN supply chains, whether that be inputs or Chinese firms. And there's the 50-50 chance at this point that Trump returns to the White House and starts his trade wars again. So then what should ASEAN actually do? I mean, I think when engaging with the US, this was a key question in some of the Q&A earlier, I think ASEAN should always be really ready to remind the US that ramping up trade restrictions on ASEAN countries would effectively be quite counterproductive to their own ends. It would only really drive the region further into China's geoeconomic orbit. Basically, America would be saying, we don't want to trade with you anymore. We see that as a source of, your trade with China as a source of leverage. We'd like you to just trade with them. It doesn't make any sense. So it doesn't make sense for America's own geostrategic interests. But also, crucially, it doesn't, in that narrow sense, it also doesn't make sense for the interests of America's partners, which include in Asia, which includes the closer partners like Australia, Japan, Korea. They don't want America ceding the region economically to China either. So I think the challenge here is to try and sell the idea of the more constructive scenario, right? A scenario where a process is beginning and it will take maybe a decade to play out, where supply chains gradually move. They move from China, they go to third countries. There are some gains in terms of resilience right there, because you now have more diversified production networks. You have knowledge moving to new jurisdictions and new capabilities being built. And especially all of this will occur at much lower cost to the United States. And I think it's worth remembering that one of the reasons why Donald Trump doesn't fully follow through on a lot of his threats is that he's quite sensitive to, in his case, the stock market reaction, essentially, right? We saw that in his first term, right? But basically, when it's clear it's going to deal a lot of economic damage, even Donald Trump balks. And even when you talk to security analysts and so on, not that you're sure as a security analyst, but we talk to security. When you do talk to security analysts, even those advocating for more substantial measures tend to balk when faced with the costs. Conversely, the happy scenario for ASEAN, where supply chains diversify and move into ASEAN and capabilities are gradually built up, actually quite a winning scenario for nearly everyone. Even China, at the end of the day, is getting too costly and it's delaying its shift out of manufacturing. But eventually, this has to occur. The costs have gone up too much. Its economy is maturing. It ultimately needs to move on. But ASEAN still needs to work on its own competitiveness in order to make all of this happen. In terms of what we are talking about today, I think the starting point should be resisting its own protectionist impulses and instead trying to stick with economic openness, because that's actually the key element of ASEAN's competitiveness. If you compare it to India, India's competitiveness is driven by having a massive internal market and not having China in the supply chain at all, and not being integrated with, well, not at all, but not being integrated into global supply chains. Whereas ASEAN's comparative advantage is really coming from the fact that it is very well integrated and therefore can compete on those kinds of costs. And of course, there is a very strong temptation to follow the US with Indonesia, talking about 200% tariffs and that sort of thing on China. I think earlier it was discussed about China's overcapacity issues. I mean, this is always difficult politically, but there's an opportunity here as well. I mean, China has a massive overcapacity in clean energy products. I mean, if America doesn't want to make use of those, then the rest of the world can, and especially when you're talking about, certainly in Australia, Australia wants to build its low carbon economy, not based on producing, some people want to, solar panels, there's a little bit of that going on, but principally about producing, low carbon industrial exports like green steel and green aluminium and so on, using cheaply produced solar energy. So the cheaper you can get the solar panels and so on, the better. For ASEAN, this is an opportunity to build out that clean energy capacity and do so cheaply. There's still more energy needs, but turn that into that green competitive advantage that it actually needs in order to, again, attract those supply chains. I think, industrial policy. There's been some discussion. I agree with Ibu Mari earlier in mentioning that. I think a key priority for the region is it's going to be tempting to engage in industrial policy, to have the next national car. Everyone knows about Proton, so we don't need to go into that further. But the risk of a subsidy war in the region, which will be very zero-sum for ASEAN's own members, is very high. So there should be some coordination around that, and surely ASEAN can play a role in coordinating around, how do we think about building a regional supply chain, but also how, because there probably will be there will be industrial policy and there will be protectionism. How can that be sort of mitigated and managed in a reasonable way and come out fairly balanced in terms of the region's overall interests? It's been said many times, absolutely, ASEAN should be supporting the WTO in terms of thinking about reform options, national security, but industrial subsidies and how climate change is integrated into the WTO. These are key issues that ASEAN can play a role in helping to shape. Not that many countries, only Singapore and Philippines are currently members of the MPIA. That's something that surely ASEAN itself, recognizing the importance of the global rules-based system, should be talking about as a group as to why aren't more countries in the region joining that. Now, that's sort of the ASEAN sort of focus thing. What about the alternative forums? There's IPEF, there's CPTPP, there's Belt and Road Initiative, and I tend to focus on BRI because it's easier to understand what China is actually talking about. But it's also got the Global Development Initiative and so on. And then there's the more geostrategically motivated Quad and BRICS. I think CPTPP is probably the most straightforward and useful in terms of promoting deeper regional integration and as a vehicle for international rule making. I think more countries in the region should absolutely join CPTPP. A question, I suppose, would be whether or not in doing so there can be more coordination amongst the ASEAN states to talk about what will be the process, what will be the requirements, and very importantly, what about the weaker, less developed ASEAN states, particularly like Cambodia and Laos? They're going to be much further away from being able to join CPTPP, but can they be on a pathway, for example, that sort of says these are the steps you're going to need to take that can set them on the right direction. When it comes to IPEF, this is a little bit more complicated. The Americans aren't offering any market access, so most of the value is in terms of working out what kind of arrangements that can be put in place, particularly around supply chain security and environmental and labor standards that are going to be essentially acceptable to America and allow them to maintain the existing level of market access. And America is reasonably open in actuality, so maintaining that level of market access, it's still the biggest consumer market in the world. Maintaining the current level of access is still a very important thing. Trump might pull out, but there's a chance that you can sort of just do what he did with NAFTA and USMCA and just recall it something else and make a few tweaks and you're done. And it's probably something worth keeping, particularly in terms of, like as I said, working out how can ASEAN actually play into America's supply chain security concerns and building that resilience rather than being a victim to it. And I know on environment and labor standards, that's always a very contentious issue for ASEAN, but as much as possible, it's actually also an opportunity for attracting supply chains. What about something like China's BRI? I think the issue with BRI is that and a lot of Chinese initiatives is they're quite amorphous. It's not clear exactly what China is saying and doing and what you're joining when you join into these sorts of things. Certainly with something like BRI, which is now a little bit clearer, the trade, the infrastructure, the investment, the technology cooperation, that's all notionally positive. I think the big drawback with BRI is that when we talk about things like ASEAN centrality, of course, BRI doesn't operate that way. It's Chinese-led. It's a Chinese hub and spoke type arrangement. It's very fragmented within China anyway in terms of how BRI is run, so multilateralizing it is not really feasible anyway. But it might be possible to multilateralize certain elements of it. So, for example, BRI-related lending has resulted in a lot of very significant debt problems in Laos, but at the same time, there doesn't appear to be any real progress in working towards a durable solution. So one idea could be whether or not AMRO, the ASEAN +3 Macroeconomic Research Office under the Chiang Mai Initiative, whether it could deepen its IMF-like functions as the trusted sort of technical honest broker in the region to assess the situation there and work towards a kind of solution. And in that way, that would be strengthening an ASEAN-led institution, but that would be bringing China in to that multilateral framework in exactly the kind of way that is necessary to work out how its actions and activities are going to fit makes sense in a more rules-based system. Finally, just very, very quickly on BRICS and Quad. I mean, I think those forums, forum shopping is great. ASEAN should be going around looking for who can offer the greatest benefits that align with its interests and while respecting ASEAN centrality. I think BRICS and Quad are very sensitive issues where not that ASEAN countries wouldn't engage with them, but so far they're not really producing any particularly tangible, obvious economic or developmental benefits. And even if it did, I think one would have to be very carefully, I suppose, weigh those benefits against the potential geopolitical costs. So maybe I'll leave it there. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roland. I think you have very much connected the dots of everything that we have been discussing today, from security-driven challenges to economic dynamics, and even connected to the nexus of climate change issue. And what is amazing is that you have really offered a lot of suggestions for ASEAN to really think about, including for ASEAN member states to join the MPIA, which we talked about in the previous session. So that's a lot for us to digest and a lot for us to think. But in the interest of time, I would now like to pass the floor over to Ambassador Sihasak to talk about really a very important topic today that I think is very timely to wrap this discussion up, and that is how do we reinvigorate ASEAN's mechanism. So we talk about all sorts of challenges, so please offer us some solutions on what ASEAN can do. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joanne. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I'm the last of a dying breed. I am a believer in ASEAN. There are not many believers these days, but looking at the audience, I see Sharon, I see Ha, I see Termsak. So I'm a little bit reassured that I'm also among believers in ASEAN. I've been in the Foreign Service for 40 years. I've seen the successes, and I've also recognized the limitations of ASEAN. We all have high expectation of ASEAN, but of course, I'm always reminded what my good friend Bilahari Kosikan said. The analogy that he has drawn, that ASEAN is a cow, but many expect ASEAN to be a horse. So I think realistically, ASEAN being a cow, it could be a more leaner and a more agile cow. When we talk about reinvigorating ASEAN-led mechanism, I think the fundamental premise that we have to start with is, how do we reinvigorate ASEAN? ASEAN is really, to be very frank, is not what it used to be. Our unity is not like before. Our centrality sometimes, is a lot of, we keep repeating, but in fact, are we really demonstrating our centrality? And the concern that I have is that there are many aspects to ASEAN centrality, but the most important aspect of ASEAN centrality is that ASEAN must be central to the foreign policy of the member countries. And this is not the case now, where I think, before we had this concept of national and regional resilience as going together. Now I think most countries are pursuing national interests rather than the regional interests. And so when it comes to important matters, national interests trump regional interests. That's the point that I wanted to make. And then we are also limited by the ASEAN way. The ASEAN way has been the key to our success. What is the ASEAN way? The ASEAN way is making decision by consensus, which is what ASEAN can never depart from, this principle of consensus. But as we continue to stick to this consensus decision making, the situation that we find ourselves in is that we make a decision that is the lowest common denominator, right? And so, Thailand, back in the year 2000, we had proposed this idea of an ASEAN troika. I don't know whether Ha remembers that. And because we believe that, the chair of ASEAN rotates every year, and different chairs have different capacity, right? So I think having a troika would facilitate the work of the chair and ensure continuity. But our ideas was accepted, but in the end, it was watered down in such a way that it could not be activated, right? Then, when we talk about reinvigorating ASEAN and ASEAN's role in this ASEAN-led mechanisms, I think this principle of non-interference is really limiting our ability to play the role that is expected of us. And the principle of non-interference was, of a different era. It has to be applied in the context of growing interdependence in ASEAN. And, and especially in the case of Myanmar, I feel that non-interference has become an excuse for inaction. And we have the ASEAN Charter. And you look at the ASEAN Charter, why do we have the Charter? We have to apply non-interference against the other principles and values that are in the Charter, right? And the bottom line for me is non-interference is not an excuse for any government to do whatever it can to its people. So, I feel that we have to really relook at the ASEAN way. Probably we cannot make great revision, but the way things are applied, perhaps we have to apply them in the present day context. And then we talk about ASEAN-led mechanism, the ARF, ADMM plus EAS. They were created under a different strategic landscape. We have to accept the fact. The strategic landscape at the time was much more benign, and there was no competition like what's happening right now. And so all the major powers had an interest in coming and having constructive dialogue and trying to build up trust and confidence, even though sometimes the dialogue were not so constructive. But the situation has changed. We have to accept the fact. Now there's much more geopolitical competition. And so the creation of the new architecture, like Quad, August, IPEF, reflect the new security dynamics in the region. And so I think that and you can see it in many ways. You can see it as competing with ASEAN architecture, or you can see it as reinforcing what ASEAN is trying to do. Some have said that the regional architecture need not be a single architecture. It could be a patchwork of architecture. But be that as it may, these architectures are inevitable because they fill a certain void that exists. And this void, ASEAN is not able to perform or expected to perform. So still, we have to keep working at revitalizing the ASEAN-led mechanism in a realistic way. If Ha can remember when we did the 2015 vision, ASEAN Vision 2015-2025, and now we're working on the post-2025 vision. Basically, you can take every word from the 2015-2025 and put it in the new vision that we are working on. First, how to strengthen ASEAN centrality in the regional architecture, how to enhance ASEAN ability to deal with rapidly evolving situations in a timely manner, how to make ASEAN-led mechanism more effective. But we haven't been able to walk the talk, really. And so I think we really need to think long and hard about the ASEAN-led mechanism and the role that I think it's still very useful in the regional architecture, which is changing, of course. I mean, yes, it's a talk shop. It will continue to be a talk shop, but let's talk on the right issues. Let's talk, in the right way. And so I think ASEAN has to be central to these ASEAN-led mechanism. And the fact that what we have to ask ourselves, are we central, to the, when we go into meetings, the ARF, EAS, we go in as individual members. We don't coordinate position. And if we do coordinate, again, it's the lowest common denominator. So ASEAN has to think about how, it can utilize this mechanism to provide a stabilizing influence in a more competitive regional architecture. I mean, of course, we cannot take head on the contentious issues, but still, this forum provides a useful forum to address issues where we have common concern, common interest, that we can have constructive discussion. So ASEAN has to be proactive, and the role of the chair is crucially important. And the chair will have to find a way of organizing the meeting in such a way that not everyone, saying their own piece, and there's no interface at all, so, which is a challenge because many member countries do not want to be dictated what they have to say. So the chair has to be very skillful, very tactful. And then there's this issue of how to ensure coherence between ARF, EAS, and ADM plus. They should not be operating in silos. And the final point I'd like to make is that, these competing architectures, or so-called competing, are inevitable. But what ASEAN has to do is push forward this idea of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, because this can provide the overarching framework for where all these mechanisms can coexist, and ASEAN needs to drive the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And so much up to now, ASEAN has been not performing that task. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ambassador Sihasak, for offering your views. Yes, indeed, you talk about the importance of ASEAN centrality, which Aries has said that really sometimes we don't even know what is the definition of it. There's something, a lot of work for ASEAN to do. And of course, there's the ASEAN way consensus decision making that makes everything at the lowest common denominator. And of course, there is an ASEAN troika, but we know that the recent ASEAN troika on the Myanmar issue didn't really quite work out as well. So there's really a lot of work that is left for ASEAN to do. And of course, there is also the fundamental question of the regional architecture, whether is there only one regional architecture and that is ASEAN Central, or can ASEAN absorb, the other major power initiatives that we have all talked about and coexist with it. So these are all things, that we will need to continue thinking about. But I'm just going to open up the question in a minute. But there's one thing that Ambassador Sihasak mentioned that I think is very important, and that is the ASEAN-led mechanisms. Because this topic is about reinvigorating ASEAN-led mechanism, and we have the ARF, East Asia Summit, and the ADMM+. So what are they doing? Everyone is doing their own thing, and are they even talking to each other? So of course, there needs to be a bit of a synergy, and AOIP is very important, and I'm glad that ASEAN actually has it. But I'm not sure if you are aware, but the latest East Asia Summit, there was no joint statement, that was released. So the East Asia Summit has become a platform for major power rivalry, right as we are talking about ASEAN centrality. And of course, the question we need to think about is that what ASEAN can do to ensure ASEAN centrality within the East Asia Summit process, because we know that EAS is the main mechanism for AOIP. Without the EAS, I don't know how the AOIP is going to really implement itself. So that's a lot of, I'm not expecting answers from every participant, every speakers here, because even myself, I do not have the answer. But I would like to open the floor to the participants here to see if they have any more questions. And in case, oh, I already have a hand at the back, please. And yes, could you come to the mic, the gentleman there, and maybe we can have this gentleman here, two gentlemen here to ask their questions first.
Good afternoon. My name is Calvin. I'm from Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, based in Jakarta. Ambassador, I'm very interested to know more about your observations on AOIP. And I think in Cambodia, there's a terminology of operationalizing AOIP. During Indonesian chairmanship, we invented the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Forum, but somehow it's ended up into a business forum. And we heard also EAS are pretty much reluctant to become a platform to talk and even operationalize the AOIP. Please, I want to know your observations, how we operationalize for this, because here in Jakarta, we have a sense AOIP has no standard. It's becoming a patchwork. It's just label things. AOIP has yet to be a game changer, like at the TAC at that time. I stop here. Thank you, Ambassador.
Well, thank you for that question. Can we have the next question?
Yes, I'm Lewa from Channel News Asia. Okay. I think the word ASEAN centrality has been mentioned more than 20 times here. And each time I hear that, I get so nervous because I don't understand what it is. But anyway, the question is like, so it's mentioned by the panelists that non-interference has become an excuse for inaction. And also ASEAN will continue to be a talk shop. My question is that about Myanmar again. So is that the price of expelling Myanmar instead of inviting them to be in the discussion all the time? Because it seems that, can I say, Asians' failure to do something about Myanmar? Thank you.
Good afternoon. My question is for Dr. Arugay. I'm Charles from CNA. This morning we have some of the speakers allude to the trend where you have middle powers. On the surface, they profess support for ASEAN centrality, but in reality, they're moving towards focusing on bilateral relations with specific ASEAN members of their choice. In what ways does minilateralism change the equation? What impact does that have on that trend? And additionally, under what circumstances can we see minilateralism becoming the new normal?
Right, thank you for those questions. I guess we already have 3 questions. May I get Ambassador Sihasak to maybe talk about the question on the AOIP, and since you are a very seasoned ASEAN diplomat, maybe you can also talk about Myanmar as well, and maybe quickly address whether ASEAN remains as a talk shop. And then maybe can I get Dr. Arugay to talk about the minilateralism and what sort of impact that it would have on ASEAN centrality. Well, I don't know from which angle you're going to approach ASEAN centrality, but anyways, I used to be from the ASEAN Secretariat. You could just give me 30 seconds. You could talk about ASEAN centrality from within ASEAN. That's ASEAN's unity. You can talk about ASEAN centrality vis-a-vis external powers. You can talk about ASEAN centrality in the regional architecture, and you can even talk about it outside the regional architecture, like coming up with a common position within the United Nations. So I will leave it to you to take your pick on what sort of ASEAN centrality you want to talk about. Thank you.
Can I begin with Myanmar? For 8 months, I was vice minister, and I was looking after a policy on Myanmar. And one of my biggest frustration is that attending all these ASEAN meetings, we always say the right thing, but we're not doing the right thing. It's always the 5-point consensus and how to implement the 5-point consensus. We've never had any discussion on that, really. And so this is, a case where ASEAN centrality is not being exercised. That's why Thailand, we initiated the humanitarian corridor, humanitarian initiative, just to start the implementation of the 5-point consensus on an issue that should be acceptable to everyone, that could rally all the parties in Myanmar and maybe lead to re-engagement of SAC, the military regime, with ASEAN, and maybe open the door to dialogue. But in all these meetings, we start to explain, what we're thinking. And I briefed the ASEAN ambassadors many times in New York, in Bangkok, in Tokyo, when we had the ASEAN Japan summit. There was hardly any substantive comments from my ASEAN colleagues. So I think that this is a case in point where on Myanmar, we haven't been able to exercise our centrality, on an issue of fundamental importance to ASEAN's unity, peace, stability of the region, and credibility. So that's on Myanmar. On the concept of ASEAN, what is the concept of ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific conceptually? I think we've been concentrating on functional cooperation. Have we laid out the concept which emphasizes inclusiveness? And can we get the other major powers to really accept the ASEAN outlook as a concept that tries to bring all the version of Indo-Pacific together? I think we haven't been able to do that. There is this idea that Marty Natalakawa once advocated, which I think, because the TAC is embraced by so many countries, 40 countries. Why don't we evolve the TAC for the wider region, for the Indo-Pacific, so that all of us respect the same ground rules, the same, the rules-based international order. So I think that's one idea that I have, but it's not easy, because when you talk about these things, it's very difficult to push it through within ASEAN. So that's my answer.
Just a short comment on the AOIP. I'd like to ask, how many national security strategy documents of countries does the AOIP been mentioned? I think if you're an ASEAN dialogue partner and you really consider ASEAN as very important, where is ASEAN in your national strategy or national security strategy documents? So it's quite easy to speak about ASEAN being important. We've heard it all day, but where's ASEAN in their cheese, right? So in a way, recognizing ASEAN is very important, I think, in this strategy documents, and this is something that could help. These countries could help ASEAN in terms of improving its centrality. So its centrality, as you mentioned, Joanne, is not just within ASEAN, but also how other countries view its importance and salience in their own larger objectives in the medium and long term. The question addressed to me, as I mentioned earlier, we will not stop seeing minilaterals in the future. This seems to be very convenient. When Sharon mentioned the boyfriend who never calls, minilaterals is a way to have these flings at the moment, fleeting flings, given the needs of certain countries, right? But that's the payoff of such also as a trade-off. Can you imagine the transaction cost and the build-up that is necessary to set up a minilateral? If we keep on repeating the minilateral making process, it's quite inefficient. And this is why multilaterals have been really the more preferred way to go. It will require long-term commitment, but at least you don't get to start from zero every time there's an issue involved. As far as bilaterals are concerned, the thing with ASEAN is that it has, throughout its history, it has been not jealous of its members pursuing strong bilateral relations with other countries. I think this is part of ASEAN's MO. If other countries have close relations to external countries within the ASEAN region, we have tolerated, or ASEAN has tolerated it with the greatest of patience and civility. We're not jealous just because one country is being close to one or the other. But what I want to emphasize for ASEAN centrality is that encouraging deeper bilateral relations among ASEAN countries is quite important. So when you grow the garden, you make sure that you grow each other's garden as well, building each other's national resilience, and having an empathy on where each other is coming from. So for example, on the South China Sea issue, it was a big thing for the Philippines to hear an ASEAN member expressing solidarity for the very first time, when it didn't happen in many incidents before. So this tells you that on this issue alone, having that amount of support from a fellow ASEAN member, I think, at least puts some form of substance to our search to improving centrality.
Thank you, Dr. Arugay. Can I just check whether we went for one round of question? Can I just check whether there are any more questions? Okay. Okay, we have one more question. Okay, just one more. Am I missing anyone out? Dr. Thamsak, yes. That's good. That means we can keep in time. Please, Dr. Thamsak.
Oh, thank you, Joanne. Actually, Ambassador Sihasak used to be one of my bosses when he was a some leader of ASEAN. I served as the ASEAN Secretary for nearly 20 years. So I know a thing or two about ASEAN centrality. And I believe ASEAN centrality has a geographical limit to only Southeast Asia. So when ASEAN claims centrality in the AOIP, I think that's wrong. ASEAN has nothing to stand on in the Indian Ocean or in Western Pacific, too far away from us. And I would say ASEAN has been quite successful in confidence building among our member states. And just learn from Dr. Aries that we have to thank Cambodia for joining ASEAN in 1999 and then made ASEAN complete as a full-fledged multilateral body. Before that, for 32 years, we were just a mini-lateral body. Well, my question for all the panel is, we have been trying to move on from confidence building to community building. My question is, where or how ASEAN can mobilize concrete resources to build a concrete, integrated ASEAN community. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Thamsak, for that question. I think it's a very good question to end this ASEAN Roundtable of, to talk about the future of ASEAN's community building, moving from confidence building to really seeing each other as part of a community. Maybe we are over our time limit, so perhaps just take a minute or so to, maybe respond to that question before we close. Thank you.
Thamsak is always.
Yes, maybe I get Mr. Rajah to start first, so since you haven't answered.
I'll go first, only because I'm sure my colleagues on the panel have more substantial answers than me. I mean, I think at the end of the day, I mean, you need it, everyone will say you need it to create some sort of bottom-up level of community, but the reality is that the top-down isn't working either at this point the way it needs to. And so I think what is required is, there are so many things, and even all the experts in this room discussing so many things, and most of it is admiring the problem. I think what maybe would be useful if we could get the top policymakers, leaders, to have a clearer sense of where the national interest lies. The regional interest can only be defined in terms of the national interests brought together. And so truly understanding what priority is one going to, say in the economic realm, which is my area, is going to be placed on a rules-based trading system over domestic policy flexibility that might meet your political needs, or maybe even might be a reasonable industrial policy even, but it breaks the existing rules, right? Recognizing that and having some understanding of those interests and being clear on that is, I think, the starting point before ASEAN can move forward.
Ambassador, you have the last word. Very quickly, Ambassador Barry Descar mentioned earlier that ASEAN is predominantly a young population, a young community. So for me, a young and increasingly middle class community. So I think moving forward, ASEAN needs to listen to them more. What is ASEAN for them? Because they're going to inherit this community, this organization from us older generation. What kind of community do they want? What values do they want to propagate? And we have done our part in trying to build ASEAN, but I think it's also important that the inheritors of this community gets to be listened to and know how to proceed, because they'll be inheriting ASEAN from us.
Well, for me, yes, maybe the ASEAN outlook goes beyond our geographical footprint, but AIF also goes beyond our geographical footprint as well, and ES. So I think sometimes we need these kind of aspirational goals for us to work towards. So that's my comment on the question by Thumbs Up. Second is the community building. You know, we talk about enhancing ASEAN's institutional capacity. And when we discussed the charter, one of the problems that we found out was non-compliance of obligations and agreements. And that's, you know, it's a very difficult problem for us to move forward on community building. And so we have to invest in secretariat. You know, the secretariat is, you know, what is the role of the secretariat in all the ASEAN meetings? He's more of a secretary than a general. That's the fact, you know. So I think we really need, because our chairmanship is changing every year, and we need a strong secretariat, and we have to invest in the ASEAN secretariat.
Right. Thank you, Ambassador Sihasak and Mr. Rajah and Dr. Arugay. So just we have come to the end of our session, and I would just like to thank our three distinguished speakers for those thought-provoking insights. And of course, we've seen today that ASEAN is indeed at a critical juncture. There are many challenges that we've talked about, but there are also significant opportunities for ASEAN to chart a new adaptation playbook. So the key takeaways are very clear. First, ASEAN needs to re-energize its existing mechanism. It needs to strengthen its collective voice and to find innovative ways to remain resilient and to find itself to be able to compete, as you have mentioned earlier. So with that, I would like to conclude our final session of today's roundtable, and I would like to wish all of you a pleasant evening ahead. Thank you.